The relationship between a performer and their audience is often built on a carefully managed illusion. In the world of British television and film, we often mistake the characters on our screens for the individuals who play them. We see the humor, the warmth, and the reliability, but we rarely see the internal cost of maintaining that public mask. Behind the accolades and the celebrity status, many of the nation's most cherished stars were navigating lives defined by chronic illness, financial collapse, addiction, and professional isolation. This script examines 15 performers who presented an image of stability to the world, while their private realities were slowly coming apart in the shadows. At number 1 is Bill Tarmy. Bill Tarmy was the gravitational center of Coronation Street for over 30 years. As Jack Duckworth, he represented the quintessential working-class husband, a man who provided comedic relief and emotional grounding to the nation's favorite soap opera. To the public, he was a figure of absolute reliability and warmth, a performer who seemed to inhabit his role with an effortless natural charm. He was viewed as a man who had successfully transitioned from the club singing circuit to becoming a foundational pillar of the ITV network. Behind the lovable facade, Tarmy's reality was a brutal struggle with deteriorating physical health. Having suffered a major heart attack in his late 30s, he spent the majority of his career in a state of chronic, agonizing pain. He lived under the constant threat of cardiac failure, often struggling to complete a day of filming without extreme physical exertion. This was a reality he kept strictly hidden from the audience, fearing that any admission of his frailty would lead to his character being written out of the show, thereby jeopardizing his ability to provide for his family. Despite his status as one of the show's most famous faces, Tarry lived under a shadow of significant financial strain. He was a man who worked not out of a desire for fame, but out of a desperate need to cover medical bills and support his family's future. He viewed his career as a necessary trade, his health for their security. This pressure created a state of permanent internal stress as he pushed his body far beyond its limits to maintain the Jack Duckworth persona that the public demanded. Tarry eventually left the show in 2010, but the toll of his secret struggle was evident. He had spent decades performing in a state of physical crisis, a fact that was only fully understood by the public after his passing. He was a man who had provided laughter to millions while existing in a state of quiet, constant suffering. His story illustrates the massive gap between the light-hearted characters we see on screen and the grueling, high-stakes reality of the actors who portray them. At number 2 is Winnie Richard. Winnie Richard was a definitive face of British television. Moving from the glamour of Are You Being Served to the matriarchal authority of Pauline Fowler in EastEnders, she was viewed as a national treasure, a woman whose career was a testament to professional longevity and public affection. To her viewers, she was the personification of the resilient, straight-talking Londoner, a performer who represented the heart and soul of the BBC's drama department. Privately, Richard was known within the industry for a temperament that was often at odds with her public sweetheart image. She was a woman of intense, uncompromising standards who frequently clashed with producers, writers, and younger cast members. Her professional life was marked by friction. She was notoriously resistant to changes in her character's narrative and was known to be vocal about her dissatisfaction on set. This created a reputation for being difficult that was carefully managed by the show's public relations team to prevent the audience from seeing the cracks in the facade. This uncompromising nature led to a state of professional isolation. As the television industry shifted toward new styles of production and storytelling, Richard found herself increasingly out of sync with the modern environment. Her exit from EastEnders was the result of a fundamental disagreement over a storyline, showcasing her refusal to yield on what she perceived as her character's integrity. She was a star who held immense power within the studio, but that power often came at the cost of harmonious professional relationships. Following her departure from the soap opera that had defined her later years, the reality of her professional struggle became more apparent. While she remained a respected figure, the industry's perception of her as a polarizing force was a significant contrast to the maternal image she projected to the public. She spent her final years maintaining a dignified distance from the media, but the stories of her on-set battles remain a testament to the fact that the most reliable stars are often the ones most willing to engage in conflict to protect their status. And number 3 is Mike Reed. Mike Reed was the personification of the Cockney Hardman, transitioning from a successful career in stand-up comedy to his iconic role as Frank Butcher in EastEnders. His public persona was built on a foundation of rugged masculinity, sharp wit, and an indomitable spirit. To the public, he was a man who could handle any situation, a high-value performer who exuded confidence and authority. He was viewed as the ultimate survivor in the volatile world of show business. Behind the exterior of the brash, laughing Londoner, Reed struggled with a dark and persistent history of clinical depression. He was a man who lived in a state of internal turmoil, often feeling trapped by the very tough guy image that had made him a star. This mental health struggle was compounded by a series of catastrophic financial decisions and business failures that left him in a state of near ruin during several points in his career. The pressure to maintain a successful public image while facing bankruptcy and mental exhaustion was an immense burden that he kept hidden from the tabloid press. Reed's life was a cycle of extreme highs and devastating lows. He would earn massive sums of money through television contracts, only to see it disappear into failed ventures or mounting debts. He was a man who felt he could never stop working, as the Frank Butcher fame was the only thing keeping the financial abyss at bay. This constant state of economic instability fueled his depression, creating a life that was far removed from the stable, affluent image of a primetime television star. Reed's sudden death in 2007 shocked the nation, but it was only then that the full extent of his personal and financial struggles began to emerge. He had spent his life playing a version of himself that was stronger and more resilient than reality allowed. He was a man who provided comfort and humor to millions while navigating a private world of darkness and instability. His story serves as a reminder that the loudest, most confident voices are often the ones masking the most profound internal silence. At number 4 is Daniela Westbrook. Daniela Westbrook began her career as the quintessential girl next door, playing Sam Mitchell in EastEnders. She was a symbol of youthful potential, a talented actress whose rise to fame was rapid and seemingly unstoppable. To the British public, she was a star with a bright future, a performer whose beauty and charm made her a favorite of both the audience and the fashion media. She was positioned as the next great leading lady of the British soap opera era. The reality of Westbrook's life was a rapid descent into an extreme and devastating addiction that was initially hidden behind the glamour of television sets and red carpets. The hidden shame of her struggle with narcotics eventually became impossible to mask, leading to a physical and professional dissolution that was played out in the most public way possible. She was a woman whose life was being dismantled by her dependency, even as she tried to maintain her status on one of the most watched shows in the country. Her struggle led to multiple departures from EastEnders and a total collapse of her professional reputation. The industry, which had once championed her as a star, became a mirror for her decline. The physical toll of her addiction became a subject of national fixation, turning a talented actress into a cautionary tale. She was a victim of the very fame that had elevated her, finding that the industry offered very little support once her dark reality could no longer be hidden for the sake of the ratings. Westbrook spent decades trying to rebuild her life and career, but the stigma of her public fall remained a permanent barrier. She was a woman who had been a household name at 18, only to find herself professionally blacklisted and personally isolated by her mid-20s. Her story is a stark illustration of how the pressures of early fame can exacerbate personal vulnerabilities, leading to a secret monster of addiction that consumes the individual while the public watches from a distance. At number 5 is Bernard Bresslaw. Bernard Bresslaw was a towering presence in the Carry On films, usually cast as the gentle giant or the dim-witted muscle. Standing at over 6 feet 7 inches, his physical stature was his primary professional asset. To the public, he was a master of physical comedy, a man whose expressive face and booming voice were synonymous with the light-hearted, slapstick humor of the era. He was viewed as a reliable comedic actor who was perfectly suited to his roles. In reality, Bresslaw was a highly intelligent, classically trained actor who felt profoundly imprisoned by his own appearance. He was a man of deep intellectual curiosity who craved the opportunity to perform Shakespeare in serious drama. Yet, he found himself perpetually typecast as the idiot. This led to a life of intense professional frustration. He viewed his most famous roles with a mixture of gratitude and resentment, feeling that his true talent was being wasted on double entendres and pratfalls. Because of his size and his comedic reputation, the high-prestige theatrical roles he desired remained largely out of reach. He lived in a state of quiet detachment from his carry-on peers, often preferring the company of books and intellectuals over the social world of the film industry. He was a man who was viewed as a clown by the public, but who felt like an artist in exile. This internal conflict created a private life defined by a search for meaning that his professional life failed to provide. Breslaw's death in 1993 marked the end of a career that many felt was unfinished. While he is remembered as a comedic icon, those who knew him understood the darkness of his unfulfilled ambition. He was a man who gave the audience exactly what they wanted while starving himself of the professional validation he truly craved. His story is a poignant example of how a star's greatest asset, their physical presence, can also become their most restrictive cage. At number 6 is Kathy Staff. Kathy Staff was a staple of British sitcom history, most famous for her role as Nora Batty in Last of the Summer Wine. With her wrinkled stockings and permanent scowl, she was the personification of the formidable Northern housewife. To the public, she was a symbol of reliable, old-fashioned comedic timing, a woman who represented a safe, nostalgic version of British life. She was viewed as a quintessential character actress who brought a sense of order and tradition to every production she joined. Privately, Staff was a woman of uncompromising standards and a remarkably sharp tongue that could be directed at anyone who failed to meet her professional expectations. While she was a devoted churchgoer and family woman, she was known within the industry for being notoriously difficult and demanding. She had little patience for the perceived lack of discipline in younger actors and was never afraid to voice her displeasure on set. This created a layer of professional friction that was entirely hidden from the viewers who saw her as a harmless, funny neighbor. Her rigid adherence to her personal values and her demanding nature led to a state of self-imposed isolation. She did not seek the camaraderie often found in long-running casts, maintaining a distance that some interpreted as coldness. She was a woman who lived by a strict moral code, and when she felt the industry or her colleagues deviated from it, she would withdraw into a state of silent, judgmental detachment. This made her a respected but often feared presence in the rehearsal room. When Staff eventually left her most famous role due to her dissatisfaction with the show's creative direction, it highlighted the uncompromising nature of her character. She was a star who would rather walk away from stable income than tolerate what she saw as a decline in standards. She passed away in 2008, leaving behind a legacy of brilliant comedic performance that masked the reality of a woman who was often as stern and unyielding in private as the character she portrayed on screen. At number 7 is Brian Rix. Brian Rix was the undisputed king of farce, a man who dominated the London stage and BBC television for decades with his frantic, trousers-dropping comedies. He was a symbol of light-hearted, innocent British fun, a performer whose only goal was to make the nation laugh. To the public, he was a man of immense joy and professional ease, a high-status entertainer who moved in the highest social circles and seemed to have a charmed life of success and acclaim. Behind the curtain of his manic comedies, Rix and his wife Gray were navigating a profound and, at the time, socially taboo domestic struggle. In 1951, their first child, Shelley, was born with Down syndrome. In an era when such children were often institutionalized and hidden from society, Rix chose to keep his daughter at home, a decision that brought significant emotional and logistical pressure. He spent his days making the nation roar with laughter, while his nights were filled with the silent, grueling reality of caring for a child in a world that offered no support. For many years, Rix kept the reality of his domestic life hidden from his professional peers. Fearing that the tragedy of his personal life would undermine his reputation as a master of comedy, he lived a double life. The manic clown on the stage and the exhausted, determined father behind closed doors. This forced secrecy created a sense of isolation. He could not share his true burdens with the industry that celebrated his light-heartedness. He was a man fighting for his daughter's dignity in the shadows, while the spotlight demanded his silliness. Eventually, Rix used his fame to become a tireless campaigner for disability rights, but the decades of hidden struggle had left their mark. He proved that the most superficial entertainers are often the ones carrying the deepest emotional weight. His story is a powerful reminder that behind the most frantic laughter often lies a quiet, enduring strength that the audience never sees until the final curtain call. At number 8 is Pat Phoenix. Pat Phoenix was the original Siren of the North, playing the iconic Elsie Tanner in Coronation Street. She was the personification of working-class glamour, a woman who was bold, fiery, and unapologetically sexual. To the millions who watched her, she was a symbol of strength and feminine independence. She was viewed as a high-value star who commanded the screen and seemed to possess an unshakable confidence that made her the queen of the ITV network. The reality of Phoenix's life was defined by a profound and paralyzing insecurity. She was a woman who was deeply haunted by her own image, constantly worrying that she was nothing more than the character she played. Her private life was a series of volatile romantic entanglements and professional anxieties that she masked with a cloud of cigarette smoke and a brash public persona. She lived in a state of constant fear that her fame would evaporate, leading to a professional life where she was often seen as demanding and defensive. Despite being surrounded by admirers and colleagues, Phoenix felt a deep sense of social isolation. She struggled to trust those around her, fearing that people were only interested in Elsie Tanner rather than Pat Phoenix. This led to a cycle of professional friction. She would frequently walk out of the show in fits of pique, only to return when her financial situation or her need for validation became desperate. She was a star who was worshipped by the public, but felt fundamentally unloved in her private reality. Phoenix's death in 1986 from lung cancer was treated as a national tragedy, but it also exposed the fragility of the woman behind the legend. She had spent her life maintaining a facade of northern grit while battling a dark internal world of self-doubt and romantic failure. She was the architect of a brilliant public image that she herself could never quite believe in, proving that the most powerful on-screen presences often belong to the most vulnerable individuals. At number 9 is Bruce Forsyth. Bruce Forsyth was the ultimate national treasure, a man whose career spanned the history of British television. From Sunday Night at the London Palladium to Strictly Come Dancing, he was the nation's favorite host, a man of endless energy, catchphrases, and good old-fashioned fun. To the public, he was a warm, approachable entertainer who lived to make people happy. He was viewed as a professional who operated with effortless ease and a genuine love for his audience. Behind the nice-to-see-you persona was a man of ruthless, uncompromising professional perfectionism. Forsyth was known within the industry for being an extremely demanding employer and a performer who would not tolerate the slightest deviation from his rehearsed scripts. His drive for technical perfection often created a high-pressure environment for his staff and co-stars. This darker side of his work ethic was a professional secret. The industry protected his image as a man of the people, while his colleagues navigated his exacting and sometimes cold demeanor. Forsyth's obsession with his craft led to a state of professional isolation. He was a man who lived for the work, often at the expense of social connections within the industry. He was respected by everyone, but close to very few, as his life was entirely centered around the maintenance of his legendary status. This singular focus created a persona that was essentially a professional machine, leaving little room for the fun and easygoing reality that the audience assumed he possessed. While his career was an unparalleled success, the reality of the man was far more complex than the smiling host on the screen. He was a performer who understood that the illusion of fun required a regime of absolute control. He passed away in 2017, and while the tributes were universal, those who worked with him remembered a man who was as disciplined and demanding as he was talented. He proved that to stay at the top for 70 years, one must often sacrifice the very warmth they project to the world. At number 10 is Martine McCutcheon. Martin McCutcheon was the UK's ultimate sweetheart in the late 90s, moving from the role of Tiffany Mitchell in EastEnders to a #1 pop career and a starring role in Love Actually. She was a symbol of aspirational success, a working-class girl who had conquered every medium. To the public, she was a figure of absolute charm and professional luck, a star who seemed destined for a lifelong career at the very top of the industry. The reality was a sudden and devastating fall into professional blacklisting and financial ruin. Following a series of health struggles and personal setbacks, McCutcheon found herself unable to secure the high-profile work that had once been her birthright. The hidden shame of her decline was a period of intense financial instability that eventually led to a public bankruptcy. She went from being the face of major brands and movies to a state of professional anonymity, a reality that she tried to hide from a public that still viewed her as a success story. The industry, which had once marketed her as a high-value icon, largely turned its back on her during her most difficult years. She found herself caught in a cycle of failed projects and media scrutiny that turned her sweetheart image into a liability. The pressure to maintain a facade of wealth and success while facing legal and financial collapse took a significant toll on her mental health, leading to a state of professional isolation that lasted for years. McCutcheon eventually managed to rebuild a version of her career, but the trauma of her sudden collapse remained a defining part of her story. She was a woman who had been given the world only to have it taken away by a combination of bad luck and an unforgiving industry. Her story serves as a reminder that, in the world of celebrity, the transition from national treasure to professional liability can happen in an instant, leaving the individual to navigate the darkness of their decline alone. At number 11 is Gareth Hunt. Gareth Hunt was the personification of the suave 1970s action hero. Best known as Mike Gambit in the New Avengers, he possessed a rugged charm and a physical presence that made him a global television icon. To the public, he was the ultimate professional, a man of action who radiated health, strength, and confidence. He was the face of iconic advertising campaigns and a staple of primetime drama, viewed as a reliable and high-status leading man who embodied the cool sophistication of the era. Behind the leather jackets and the choreographed fight scenes, Hunt was battling a severe and increasingly debilitating addiction to alcohol. While he maintained a professional facade on set, his private life was defined by a dark struggle to control a dependency that threatened to derail his career at every turn. He lived in a state of constant anxiety, fearing that his secret monster would be exposed by the tabloid press, which would have instantly ended his status as a family-friendly action star. This internal battle forced Hunt into a state of professional and social isolation. He became increasingly guarded, avoiding industry parties and social circles where his drinking might be noticed. He was a man who performed his heroic duties under the red light of the camera, only to retreat into a solitary world of dependency once the director called cut. This double life created a profound sense of loneliness, as he felt he could never truly be himself around the peers who admired him. Hunt's career eventually slowed as his health and reliability were impacted by his private struggles. While he continued to work, he never again reached the heights of his New Avengers fame. He passed away in 2007, and while he was remembered as a television hero, those close to him knew the reality of the man who had spent decades fighting a silent war against himself. His story is a classic example of how the most heroic public images can often mask a very human and very dark private reality. At number 12 is Joan Sims. Joan Sims was the versatile heart of the Carry On franchise, appearing in more of the films than almost any other female lead. She was a master of comedic timing, moving effortlessly from playing the glamour girl to the battle-axe matron. To the public, she was a source of endless joy, a woman who seemed to embody the fun and irreverent spirit of British comedy. She was viewed as a dependable, warm, and hilariously funny professional who was loved by millions. The reality of Joan Sims' life was a heartbreaking contrast to the laughter she generated. She lived a life of profound, alcohol-fueled loneliness. Despite her professional success, she struggled with deep-seated insecurities regarding her appearance and her personal worth. She never married or found a long-term partner, leading to a state of domestic isolation that she filled with a worsening dependency on alcohol. This was a dark reality that she and her close-knit circle of carry-on colleagues kept strictly hidden from the public to preserve her funny image. Sims' final years were spent in a state of quiet reclusion. As the roles dried up and her health failed, she became a figure of tragic solitude in her London flat. The industry that had profited from her comedic genius for decades offered little in the way of support as she faded from spotlight. She was a woman who had spent her life making others laugh to escape her own internal darkness, only to find that when the laughter stopped, the silence was deafening. Sims passed away in 2001, and her death marked the end of an era. It was only then that the full extent of her lonely, troubled existence became known to the broader public. She was a star who had provided the nation with a sense of community and fun, while she herself existed on the margins of emotional despair. Her story remains one of the most poignant examples of the sad clown trope in British entertainment history. At number 13 is Arthur Lowe. Arthur Lowe created one of the most enduring characters in the history of the BBC, Captain Mainwaring in Dad's Army. He was the personification of the self-important but ultimately well-meaning British middle class. To the public, he was a brilliant character actor whose pomposity was a source of endless affection. He was viewed as a national treasure, a man whose professional discipline and comedic timing were the foundation of the nation's favorite sitcom. In reality, Lowe was often just as difficult, class-conscious, and pompous as the character he portrayed. He was known within the industry for his rigid professional standards and his refusal to socialize with his subordinate cast members. He took his status incredibly seriously and was notoriously resistant to direction or criticism. This created a state of professional friction on set. He was not playing a role so much as he was projecting his own uncompromising and often abrasive personality through the scripts. Lowe's refusal to engage in the typical camaraderie of the industry led to a state of social detachment. He was respected for his talent, but he was not particularly well liked by those who had to navigate his difficult moods and his demands for absolute deference. He lived a life of quiet upper-middle-class isolation, maintaining a distance from the common world that he felt mirrored his own perceived status. He was a man who lived within a self-constructed bubble of importance. Lowe's death in 1982 was a major blow to the industry, but the stories of his on-set behavior soon began to circulate. It revealed a man who found it impossible to separate his ego from his art. He was a brilliant performer, but the darkness of his personality lay in his inability to see beyond his own professional and social hierarchy. He proved that sometimes the most convincing characters on screen are not acts of imagination, but reflections of an actor's most difficult traits. At number 14 is Dora Bryan. Dora Bryan was a versatile star of the stage and screen, winning a BAFTA for A Taste of Honey and appearing in everything from Last of the Summer Wine to Absolutely Fabulous. She was the personification of the cheerful character actress, a woman whose energy and distinctive voice brought light to every scene. To the public, she was a symbol of professional longevity and irrepressible spirit, viewed as a wholesome and reliable entertainer. Behind the cheerful exterior, Bryan was battling a dark and destructive lifelong addiction to gambling. For decades, she spent her substantial earnings at the tables, often facing significant financial crises that she kept strictly hidden from the public and the industry. This addiction created a state of permanent internal stress, as she had to work relentlessly to pay off debts and maintain the lifestyle that her public image demanded. She was a woman living on the edge of financial ruin while playing the happy-go-lucky character for the cameras. The shame associated with her addiction led Brian to maintain a level of social and professional secrecy that isolated her from her peers. She could not admit the true reason for her constant need for work, leading many to believe she was simply a workaholic. She navigated the dark world of casinos in secret, a stark contrast to the church-going maternal image she often projected in her later years. She was a woman who was all in on a secret life that threatened to dismantle everything she had built. Brian eventually addressed her struggles in her autobiography, but the decades of hidden turmoil had already taken their toll. She was a star who had provided the nation with stability and laughter while her own life was a high-stakes gamble. She passed away in 2014, leaving behind a legacy of brilliant performance that was underpinned by a secret, frantic struggle for financial and emotional survival. At number 15 is Lionel Bart. Lionel Bart was the king of the West End, the man who wrote the musical masterpiece Oliver, and was once hailed as the heir to George Gershwin. In the early 1960s, he was one of the wealthiest and most influential creative forces in Britain. To the public, he was a genius who lived a life of ultimate luxury, cars, and parties, a man who had conquered the world through sheer talent and charm. He was the personification of the high-prestige creative icon. Bart's fall was as spectacular as his rise, due to a series of catastrophic business decisions, including selling his rights to Oliver for a fraction of their worth and a devastating descent into drug and alcohol addiction. He went from immense wealth to total destitution. For years, he lived a dark reality as a man who had lost everything, existing in a state of professional blacklisting and personal ruin. He was a man who had provided the world with its most famous songs while he himself was living in a drug-fueled haze of anonymity. The industry that had worshipped him during his years of success largely abandoned him during his decline. He became a reclusive figure, living in a small flat and struggling to reclaim his creative spark. The hidden shame of his poverty and his addiction was a stark contrast to the glamorous image the public still associated with his name. He was a man who was haunted by his own past success, living as a ghost in a world he had once owned. Bart's eventual redemption in the 1990s was a bittersweet conclusion to a tragic story. He had spent the majority of his life in a state of self-destruction and financial exile. He passed away in 1999, and while the tributes focused on his genius, the reality was a life defined by a secret monster of excess and loss. He remains the definitive cautionary tale of the British entertainment industry, a man who gave the world everything only to be left with nothing but his secrets.